All right. In this particular PowerPoint presentation, I would like to talk to you about two ideas. First, the evolution of the concept of rights, and second, the historical road taken to the Constitution of the United States. Now, both of these ideas, the evolution of rights and the Constitution, and the road to the Constitution, are immensely important. First of all, why talk about the evolution of rights? Because the idea of rights is not self-evident. We talk a lot about in American politics, in American society, about having rights. I have a right to say that. You have no right to tell me what to do. And of course, in our founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution of the United States, the idea of rights is a very prominent idea. So we want to understand where does this idea come from? Because it's not self-evident. And if you grow up in a different culture, or if you know a lot about other cultures, then you also know that rights is also not something that is self-evident. I mean, it's not taken for granted because rights are important. So first we begin with natural law. Natural law originated as an idea in the 4th century before Common Era. So around 2,300 years ago, with the school of thought known as Stoicism. And Zeno of Citium was believed to have been the main founder of the Stoic philosophy. Zeno basically believed that the universe was moral and it was arranged in a law-like fashion. So it was not disorderly and it was not evil, but rather it was balanced and moral. And we had to strive in our own lives as well for balance and morality. And natural law was developed further by Cleanthes and Chrysippus. And from Greece, this philosophy traveled to Rome. It's not surprising because Romans have, once they conquered Greek city-states, actually Romans have adopted much of Greek culture, including much of Greek philosophy. Stoicism eventually became so important in the Roman Empire that even Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius became a Stoic philosopher and remains to this day an important philosopher from that school. Now, we have to understand that natural law and natural rights are related ideas because both are derived from nature. How do we know natural law exists? By observing nature. How do we know natural rights exist? By observing nature. But they're not one and the same, and one does not necessarily follow from the other. So natural law as an idea developed first, and for many, many centuries, philosophers of at least the Stoic school accepted the idea of natural law without accepting the idea of natural rights. Natural rights is a much more recent idea. It's traced to the 14th century Europe. So just about on the cusp of Renaissance is when we find the idea of natural rights. We also should talk about the idea of constitutionalism, because constitutionalism as an idea augmented and supported the idea of rights. In England in 1215, the English nobility basically forced King John to issue Magna Carta, which translated from Latin means Great Charter, a document that states that the power of the king is not absolute. It's a remarkable idea because it implies that a legal document limits the power of the ruler. Power can be limited legally. Next is Renaissance philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588 and he lived a long life of over 90 years. Thomas Hobbes believed that by nature people were evil and selfish, and if they had no government, they would infringe on each other's rights. They would try to increase their own happiness, or as he called it, felicity, at the expense of their fellow human beings. And in such a state, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So in order to stop that, Hobbes proposed that people should create a social contract among themselves. And this contract would state that people are surrendering almost all of their power to the government, and the government would then, on the behalf of the people, protect the people from themselves, because people could not be relied on themselves to protect themselves because they were evil and selfish. John Locke, who was 2 generations after Thomas Hobbes, Locke was born in 1632, became an important philosophical figure and also a political figure, because he would become the writer of the Constitution of colonial South Carolina. Locke was by training a physician, but he's most known as a philosopher. He believed that human beings were good, basically good, imperfect to be sure, but not evil like Thomas Hobbes said they were. However, Locke believed that without government, people's imperfections would still come through. So they would tend to overreact, for example. Let's say that your neighbor steals from you, and you could become so angry at your neighbor for stealing from you, you could kill him. And that's not good because it's disproportional according to Locke. So in order to fix that, people would create a contract, but not a contract between themselves to give all their power to the government, but a contract between themselves and the government. And the purpose of the government would be, according to John Locke, to protect people's natural rights. And he even told us what those natural rights are. They are life, liberty, and estate. By the word estate, John Locke meant what we today mean private property. And Locke said all of these three rights, life, liberty, and estate, can be summarized in the phrase property rights. Why property rights? Because these rights were proper to you. They were yours and yours alone. The English Bill of Rights was an important document passed by the British Parliament in 1689, a year after the Glorious Revolution confirmed the supremacy of Parliament over the king. And the English Bill of Rights is historically so important because it became a model for America's own Bill of Rights. It granted certain civil and political rights. For example, no taxation by the king could become law without parliamentary representation, i.e. without Parliament approving the taxes. Freedom from the standing army, right? So unless the Parliament agreed to have a standing army, the king could simply not create and maintain one just because he wanted one. It also established freedom to bear arms, at least for Protestants. The English Bill of Rights also guaranteed free and fair elections, what we would call free and fair elections today. The king could not interfere in people electing their parliamentary representatives. Freedom of speech in Parliament. That is to say, a member of Parliament speaking in Parliament on any issue could not be silenced. Freedom from cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bail. This parallels almost exactly what became our own Eighth Amendment in the United States. Freedom from fines and forfeitures without trial. This is very close to some of the provisions of the Fifth and 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason, a very important politician from Virginia, was inspired by the English Bill of Rights, and Virginia Declaration of Rights, written in 1776 in June, became a model for Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, written in July of that year. Mason was very important. He was a politician. He served in Virginia's legislature, known as the Virginia House of Burgesses. He was one of the largest landowners in Virginia, and he became later a He became later a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, even though he himself, George Mason, at the end refused to sign the Constitution of the United States because it lacked a Bill of Rights. So the Virginia Declaration of Rights becomes one of the models for Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and as you already know, Independence Day is celebrated on the 4th of July, the day of the promulgation of the Declaration of Independence. At age 33, Thomas Jefferson wrote this declaration. It has two parts, the philosophical part and the historical part. The historical part contains a list of specific complaints against the English king. And so that's less important to us right now because we are not in a history class. But the first part, the philosophical part, is important. And Jefferson borrowed not only from the Declaration of Rights, Virginia Declaration of Rights, but also from John Locke, particularly from John Locke's book called The Second Treatise of Government. And actually, Thomas Jefferson's verbiage in the first portion of the Declaration of Independence parallels very close the verbiage of John Locke, particularly when Jefferson writes that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What we see here is that Jefferson substituted Locke's estate with the pursuit of happiness, possibly because not everyone possessed property, and Jefferson wanted to make the Declaration of Independence as broadly appealing as possible. Now, in addition to these philosophical documents just discussed, we also have to talk about a very practical and crucial document called the Articles of Confederation, written in 1777 and adopted officially in 1781. The Articles of Confederation became the first government of the United States. So it was in March of 1781 that the United States was technically founded as a country, not, as you might think, on the 4th of July of 1776, even though that is considered to be the Independence Day. That was just a proclamation. But when you talk about March of 1781, that's when the first government of the United States was officially established by the Articles of Confederation. But the United States was anything but united. Rather, the Articles of Confederation established a loose union of independent states, comparable to North Atlantic Treaty Organization today. That is to say, an agreement, an arrangement for cooperation during war, a wartime alliance that didn't really work well as a single government in civilian times. For example, the central government established by the Articles was so weak that it could not borrow money at home and abroad. It could not demand money from the states. It could only ask for money. And in addition, what was happening is it could not force the states to contribute soldiers. It could only ask the states to do so. It could not draft people into the military. Not surprisingly, this particular government would not last. So it's important to remember that even the United States suffered a governmental failure, that in fact the beginning was inauspicious because the first government fell. And not only did it fall, but it fell very quickly after being established. The principle was of the Articles was one state, one vote. So even though the larger state were expected to contribute more, and any changes had to be approved unanimously, which meant that there was almost no chance of changing anything because it's very difficult for all 13 states to agree on something. The Revolutionary War took place between 1775 and 1783. One of the main causes was the sheer growth, territorial and demographic, of the American colonies. So they grew from the initial settlement, a single settlement in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia, to 13 fairly significant states by the 1770s. And population-wise, in the 18th century, the growth was explosive. The number of European settlers and their slaves went from 200,000 in 1700 to 2 million in 1770. That's immense. That's astounding growth, signifying astounding level of prosperity which permitted it, which allowed it. The Revolutionary War also was based in the British desperation to raise money, because the British had spent a lot of money in the French and Indian Wars that took place between 1755 and 1763, as the British tried to dislodge the French from their North American possessions and try to protect their own from both the French and their Indian allies. So because the British treasury was on the brink of total bankruptcy, the British decided to raise taxes on American colonists without their consent. So you talk about taxation without representation. And the British also gave preferential treatment to their businesses at the expense of American colonial business interests, and that upset a lot of colonists, leading to acts of economic rebellion like the Boston Tea Party, the protests which led British to retaliate like the Boston Massacre, and so the situation gradually escalated. Now, the first battle was the Battle of Lexington and Concord, 1775. So this is when we say the war began. And we also have to understand that when the war began, the majority of Americans did not want independence. The most northern state, the New England states like Massachusetts, were very, very much pro-independence. States in between, geographically, like New York and New Jersey, were on the fence. They were about equally divided. But southern states were pro-British. They were the most loyal states. I should say colonies. They were the most loyal colonies. And there was a lot of fear that Southerners would not join this fight for independence. So the Continental Congress appointed George Washington to lead the Continental Army. This was a fairly average general, and this is putting it mildly. George Washington, but he was chosen, even though on paper there certainly were more distinguished, more talented generals, such as Benedict Arnold, such as Horatio Gates. But Washington was chosen because he was a Southerner and because he was rich, and he was viewed as a safer choice because he was less susceptible to bribery. As you might know from the story of Benedict Arnold, who turned traitor because he was in debt and he took money from the British. This proved to be a wise choice on part of Continental Congress to appoint George Washington as the head of the Continental Army. So thanks to Washington's perseverance, although not thanks to his brilliance as a general, because as a general he wasn't brilliant, thanks to his perseverance, thanks to the guerrilla warfare, American militias were sniping at the British, reducing their ranks, and the British found it very difficult to resupply because their reinforcements were 3,000 miles away, and so it was very difficult for them to get resupplied and to send fresh troops into the field every time. And also thanks to foreign aid, particularly that of the French. After 1777, when the American army led by Horatio Gates achieved victory at the Battle of Saratoga, the French decided to stick it to the British and to help Americans separate from the British Empire. Finally, in 1781, thanks to George Washington being reinforced on land by Lafayette and Rochambeau, and at sea, Admiral de Grasse, the French general, blockaded the coast off of Virginia, not allowing Cornwallis to get resupplied. Cornwallis surrendered after the bombardment of Yorktown. He surrendered to George Washington. That was the end. The British decided not to fight after 1781, and in fact, in 1783, at the Treaty of Paris, the British recognized the United States as an independent country. After the war, there was a lot of damage done, damage to the infrastructure, but also, I mean, human damage in terms of human resources lost. A lot of the skilled and rich people, I'm talking about lawyers, I'm talking about doctors, they were loyal to the British. Not all of them, obviously, but a lot of them were loyal to the British. And after the Revolutionary War was lost, they fled the United States. They fled to Canada, they fled to England, so that this damaged the country even more. Due to bad economic times, farmers were literally losing their farms. Some would end up in debtor's prison. In the 18th century, if you could not pay your debts, you could end up in debtor's prison. This became dangerous because you have all these men returning from the army, having fought for this new country of theirs, now facing damaging economic times, suffering economic losses, and possibly being sent to prison for not being able to pay their debts. So they rebel. A number of rebellions broke out. The one that's mentioned in every textbook on American government is Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Revolutionary Army. The idea was to shut down courthouses so that the courts could not foreclose on the farms and take those farms away from the farmers. The state of Massachusetts was temporarily in panic because there was no money to pay for the Massachusetts state militia. Eventually, money was raised from private funds, and the rebellion was put down. But it was tough going for a while, and we have to remember that a number of similar rebellions broke out in the rest of the country. Now, notice I'm saying country and not colonies, and I'm doing so intentionally because colonies stopped being colonies in 1781 when the Articles of Confederation were officially approved. So we're now talking about the states, and we're talking about this economic crisis and rebellions that flow from it. And this was a warning sign to many people, particularly far-sighted people who wanted a change, who understood that at the very minimum you would need to make changes to the Articles of Confederation if you wanted to save this brand new country from itself, from its own structural weakness, from the weakness of its political institutions that seemed unable to cope with crisis. Also, you had squabbles that turned into shooting exchanges, not a full-fledged war perhaps, but shooting exchanges between Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Delaware over the right to fish for oysters in the Delaware River and in the Chesapeake Bay. And that was serious. They tried to address it, starting with the Mount Vernon meeting in 1785, but then at a larger meeting in Annapolis in Maryland in 1786, and that meeting failed because they didn't have a quorum. Finally, in 1787, they called for a convention of all states with the specific purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. The convention began in May of 1787. 55 men have attended, but in the end, only 42 delegates remained, 3 of which, George Mason, William Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry, refused to sign at the very end. And so you only had 39 who signed the Constitution of the United States, 39 delegates, and the secretary. They signed this Constitution of the United States, this brand new document on which they worked in secrecy and which was produced in violation of the specific mission for which they were sent to Philadelphia. Remember, the mission was to revise the Articles of Confederation, not to change them. I'm sorry, not to abolish them. But they abolished them. They didn't change them. They just got rid of them. And they said, well, now we have this new document. You're going to love it. And you only now need 9. They said you need 9 out of 13 states to approve it. And eventually, it would be approved in June of 1788. The Constitution of the United States would be officially approved, or as we say in political science, ratified. And this is how we got our document that we still use to this day. With revisions, there would be 27 amendments after 1787 to the present day. But the Constitution was, the original Constitution was written in the summer of 1787 and ratified in June of 1788. So some of the most important takeaways here is the first government of the United States has actually failed. The Articles of Confederation not only failed, but they failed very quickly after being adopted. So if at first you don't succeed, you might as well try again. So the first experiment at self-government at the national level was a failure in the United States. Second, the United States was a war-born country, a battle-born country. It came out of the war. It was not a country that was put together in a nice, fashionable, genteel way with people sitting around the table, drinking coffee or tea and engaging in philosophical discussion. It came out of blood and iron. It came out of war. And not just any war, but a very important type of war, a war for independence by a colony or by a conglomeration of colonies against their colonial masters. And so this became actually an example. 2 centuries later, it would become an example for many, many other regions of the world to separate and to overthrow their colonial masters and establish their own countries based on the idea of self-determination. And when they do so, the document that they refer to most often is the Declaration of Independence. It becomes the model for virtually every single movement that tends to assert its rights against the rights of the domineering, the oppressive power. Thank you.